This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Writing can be cathartic, and for novelist Jennifer Gilmore, it's a way to tell parts of her own personal story. Gilmore, like thousands of Americans, chose adoption to start a family. But it wasn't an easy journey. She's written about her experiences that have shaped her fictional books like The Mothers and If Only. Today, Where We Live, we talk with Gilmore about why she chose open adoption in the U.S. Have you adopted a child or children? What was the process like for you and your family? Later, we'll explore how adoptees in Connecticut have been pushing lawmakers to let them obtain their original birth certificates. You can join our conversation, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Jennifer Gilmore joins us via Skype today. She's also a visiting assistant professor of English at Lafayette College. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start off when we talk about open adoption. What does that mean exactly?
Open adoption, which most adoptions are domestically in this country, means that the birth family, the birth mother, the birth father, and the prospective adoptive parents know each other to varying degrees, depending on what they agree on.
And so this option, why was that desirable for you and your husband?
Well, we went into this, we learned a lot as we were going through the process, which was very protracted, but we decided, like most people do, that we wanted what was best for the child. And from all the research we did, knowing who your biological family is really better for the child as he or she grows.
How soon after you and your husband were married did you decide open adoption was the route you were going to take?
Oh, it was a while. I mean, we had been married several years. I had a career in publishing. I had a career as a novelist. He had a career as a visual artist. And I knew it was going to be difficult for me to have a biological family as I'd been sick in my 20s. We tried IVF many times, and, you go down one specific rabbit hole and it's hard to get out. So it wasn't that we were necessarily tied to this idea of genetics or having our own quote unquote biological children. It was more that we started that way and dumped all this money into it. And so wanted to kind of see that through. And when that didn't work out, we just, so many people will say to you, just adopt, as if it's so easy. But we pulled out of the IVF, I think it was after maybe 5 rounds. I'm sort of in disbelief about that now. And then started the adoption process. So we'd probably been married 10 years.
Mm. Did you seek out other people who've gone that route of open adoption, or how did you do your research, Jennifer?
Like how I usually do research, how I do research for books, which is reading a lot, but also talking to a lot of people. At my age, I had known a lot of people who were adopted, and those children had mostly closed adoptions. And I know that they struggled with that. So that's another reason why open adoption became very interesting to us. We lived in Brooklyn, New York at the time. We had many friends who were adopting. And so we had sort of a community to work with. And a lot of people sort of quote unquote matched, which I'm sure we'll talk about what that means later, with birth mothers, and starting their families with adoption. And it looked really wonderful and remains really wonderful in a lot of ways. So that's the route we decided to take. The reason we did domestic was, I don't know how much you want to get into this, but international at the time. So this was 9 years ago now. And international adoption like Russia and Guatemala, those were still open countries when we started to look at adoption. And yet it seemed very volatile, which, what would happen? Russia has since been closed off to the U.S., same with Guatemala. And we had the sense that what was happening in those countries wasn't necessarily what was best for the children. So we decided that having the ability to choose and having the birth mother choose us gave people a choice in the matter, and that felt more ethical.
So Jennifer, walk us through the process. So how did you begin? Did you go through an agency? Did you seek out a birth mother? Is there like a type of website that you can use?
Well, again, so I am lucky enough to have a 6-year-old who we adopted 6 years ago. So I haven't done this in 6 years, though I am very in touch with what's going on, and I do write about it a lot. But we because it was such a protracted experience, we began with an agency, and we did a training with them, and down south, where we got pictures together, learned about what open adoption was. We began writing letters to an anonymous birth mother, whoever she may be, and they have sort of a record of all their quote unquote clients or prospective adoptive parents, and then they have a website where the birth mothers and sometimes birth fathers as well come, and they do intakes with them, and they have sort of a file of them and all the things that you fill out in your profile, which includes, it's very disarming at first, what race you're comfortable parenting, how much drug use, mental health issues. And I'm not saying that these are all equivalent things, but they're all sort of lumped together, and you fill out these forms, and you get matched through the agency with these birth mothers. When we were starting to do this, we went online as well through their through their websites. And so it was a combination of old-fashioned in-person matching, and then this sort of digital internet search, which has since taken over. We had a lot of problems with the internet because, I'm a novelist. I'd had a lot published, and we were forced to use our first and last names. And so people could really find me. And that became problematic later. So we had to stop using that agency. But that's how it began, in any case.
Jennifer Gilmore is joining us via Skype. She's an adoptive parent, also author of several novels, including 2 that center on adoption, The Mothers and If Only. As we learn more about the open adoption experience that Jennifer had, as well as why some adoptive families choose to have this open adoption process with biological parents, you can join our conversation, 860-275-7266 here on Where We Live. Jennifer, I wanted to learn more about the process again that you were just outlining for us, starting with the letters. So, in effect, you're selling yourself to these birth parents. So, what did you include in those letters?
Yeah, well, my husband and I made a pact that we were going to be as honest as possible. And I don't, because you are selling yourself, you want to be chosen. But, as a novelist and just as a person, I have no idea what somebody's memories are going to be. I remember talking to a birth mother who matched with a friend of mine who had written about a Christmas tree, and she had memories of like chopping down a tree with her father, and that really connected her. So without knowing a person, you're just really writing to an idea. You really have to be sort of true to who you are. And the more specific you are, and the more you can sort of show who you are as people. And we were really authentic about that. We had pictures of, with our niece and nephews, with our friends' children. We had all our hobbies, and we travel a lot because of a variety of reasons. So, hopefully we would appeal to a birth mother who at that time could deal with her child living in New York City, which was a hindrance, it seemed. And who liked to travel, who was in the arts. And in that way, sort of, you are connecting almost in a genetic way. So that was really, I want to just say also about open adoption, as much trouble as we had in the process, we had a lot of, I wouldn't even call them birth mothers because they weren't real. We had a lot of scams, and I'm sure we'll get into some of the real hiccups, which is a generous word, that can happen in open adoption. Our open adoption now is a wonderful thing. I have no fear about the birth parents or the birth parents' families. We see them every year. I'm so happy that my son gets to see where he comes from. And a child can't have too much love. So when it works out, it really works out. The process can be really hard.
We're going to learn more about how you found your son in just a little bit, Jennifer. But back to filling out the form of the kind of baby you wanted. What was open to you and your husband? You mentioned race. So I'm just curious, like how you had those conversations, and how did you? Which boxes did you check off? Which ones were you not comfortable checking?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. It was shocking to sort of get these boxes as if people can be fit into boxes. So I think most adoptive parents have thought more about parenting than most people. Why do you want to be a parent? People would ask me, and it's a difficult question. In regards to the boxes, we were, I mean, and I'm not patting myself on the back for this in any way, but we were very open to all races. We wanted to be parents, and we would have done diligence if we had a transracial adoption to try and make that. I mean, I have a lot of friends who have transracial adoptions, and they work really hard to make that experience, to celebrate all backgrounds of their kids. But we weren't incredibly comfortable with children with challenges, physical challenges, largely because of how we were living. Right, a fourth floor walk up in New York City. We had a tiny apartment. We just didn't feel like we were the best family for that child. But other than that, we were fairly open. I think we went into the drugs and alcohol box, with trepidation, and then learned a lot about it, and learned also, how many people do you know who don't know they're pregnant for the first 3 months and have a glass of wine with their salmon? I mean, so if you're saying, I don't want any alcohol, you are eliminating so many people. So it's really, and I also found, and this is very interesting, boxes are just boxes, but when we met, and then you get these big self-reports, these medical reports of their families, and it's frightening. I mean, if I was to lay out my family, that history, I don't think it would look that great in all the places either. So once you meet people, everyone has their story, and you kind of fall in love with the person.
So Jennifer, you're talking about you would have to check a box if you were comfortable if, say, the birth mother had prior drug use. Is that what you're talking about?
Different kinds of drugs, different kinds of alcohol. They're all kinds of boxes. So you really had to educate yourself in what that meant, and what you're taking off the table if you say no drug and alcohol use. That also means, in this sort of algorithm, it means antidepressant medication. Mm-hmm. So you have to work with what you're comfortable with, but you have to stay with what you're comfortable with and be true to your limits, I guess.
So when you went through this process, were you thinking that you would hear from a birth mother and be connected with the baby fairly soon? I mean, what was the timeline for the first connection?
The mantra of adoption is it's not if you get a child, it's when, right? And again, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this later in the segment, but there are a lot more people who want children than there are children in the adoption community. And I'm talking about infants. The foster care to adopt is a very different system. But so we didn't know any of these things. We thought, we're so cool. We'll get it, whatever silly thing you say about you tell yourselves. And we didn't understand that when you match with a birth mother, that doesn't mean that that's going to come to fruition. And in some ways, that's fair and ethical. A woman who is going to give birth to a child has every right to change her mind and make decisions that she thinks is best for her child. And I want to emphasize that in this situation, I mean, I feel like birth mothers do get vilified a lot, and they are placing their children because they don't feel they'll be the best mothers for them. They are doing it out of love. And I really began to understand that. We were dealing with a lot of women who weren't birth mothers in the end. They weren't even pregnant. But the birth mothers we did deal with, even though we were quote unquote matched and things happened along the way that changed that, and we didn't end up parenting their children, they, I think were trying to do the best they could for their child.
Jennifer, tell us more. You said that along the way, you were then contacted with women who ended up not being pregnant. Yes. So they were trying to scam you. How did they get your information?
Well, as I mentioned, we had to put our first and last names on these sites. So I would get, at any time, you have an 800 number, you have an email account, you are open to sort of, and I think that there needs to be more protection for prospective adoptive parents, but as open you are and as available as you are, the more you will be contacted. So we would kind of let ourselves be open. A lot of, as we know in this world, a lot of people are in trouble. And we had some emotional scams, people who didn't even want money. They just wanted to talk. They wanted to feel powerful for once. So I was in a very long relationship. I think I wrote about this in an essay for the New York Times with a woman who I don't believe was pregnant. And we had a long email relationship, and then, she sort of disappeared. I've even met her once. And again, this is, we have this all the time. I mean, I'm reading about, all these kinds of romantic scams. In a way, this is a romantic scam. This is a way to get, for people to have emotional control. So even though I understand it now, in hindsight, it was very, very painful to think, oh, I'm going to have this baby and here's the due date and so on. And I'm going to have this real relationship, this sort of loving relationship with the birth mother that's really open. And then to have it not be real is really disturbing.
Jennifer, you've written about other instances during this journey to adopt a baby where you, in fact, did adopt a baby, but the baby ended up going back to the birth mother. That must have been a painful experience. Can you talk a little bit about what happened?
Mm-hmm, sure. I mean, technically, the baby hadn't been adopted yet. So you wait. I was there with this birth mother who my husband and I had a pretty extensive relationship with. And I cut the umbilical cord of this baby, and we were waiting for the paperwork to go through. So there's a couple of weeks of this paperwork of processing. And each state is different, which is also an issue, but the birth mother, and I believe this is completely ethical, has the right to change her mind. What happened in this instance was not that she changed her mind. It was that she was in an abusive relationship and the baby was someone else's and she wanted to keep the baby safe, but she had no intention of having us parent the child. So when that all went down in a very complicated and very upsetting, traumatizing way, the baby is no longer with us. We had him for a couple of weeks. We hadn't taken him home yet. We were still waiting for things to go through. So these kinds of things can happen. It's hard to think about how laws can protect everyone. The birth mother needs to be protected. The birth mother needs to be able to change her mind. How can you know when you're pregnant what it's going to feel like once the baby comes? But at the same time, these kinds of scams or ploys are very, very difficult and so challenging on prospective adoptive parents who are financially strapped often and really emotionally distraught even by the time they get to the process.
So what made you and your husband keep going, going up and down this roller coaster, Jennifer?
We were very close with the person who was doing our home study, which is something where they come to your house and they make sure the fire alarms are in place and that you have everything. And they talk with you about who you are. And that usually happens once, but it happened 3 times for us. And the third time she said, so many people would have opted out on this. And we just said, we're just in it. It was something we both agreed on, that we really wanted to see it through. And somebody said to me, a really good friend said to me once, everyone I know who really wanted a child got one. And I was so offended. People say the craziest things to you when you're trying to adopt, when you have an adopted child. They don't do it out of malice, but they say crazy things. So I thought, so if I don't do this enough, if I don't want this enough, it won't happen. But, that's not true. We have to know our limits. And I don't think we knew our limits. In the end, now looking back, I'm so glad, that we stayed in it. But I think it's okay to say, I can't do this anymore. And to say, I get a lot of mail from people who are in it and they are so distraught, or their person who they thought they were adopting has been taken for a variety of reasons. I mean, it's so awful to hear these stories. So how do you extricate yourself once you're sort of in it? It's very hard. But I think once you make a decision to live a quote unquote child-free life or to keep going, it's just the decision that's really the hardest part.
And what about the impact on your marriage, Jennifer, during all of this?
Yeah, it was really challenging. I mean, I was lucky in that my husband and I thought about the big picture in the same way. That he really didn't want to do IVF. He wanted to go straight to adoption. So he was really on board. We were thought we're the kind of people who sweat the small stuff. So the dailiness was very difficult, but we really felt like we wanted to do this. But yeah, it was really challenging. And financially it was really challenging, which also adds stress to a marriage. So yeah, I don't wish to be in that moment again.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Jennifer Gilmore is my guest today. She's an adoptive parent, also a novelist. We're talking about her experience with open adoption, and we want to hear from you, too, if you've experienced open adoption. Why did you choose this route to start a family? You can join our conversation, 860-275-7266. When we're back from the break, we'll hear more about how Jennifer was able to adopt successfully, and we'll talk more broadly about the laws in place to protect birth mothers, as well as what's needed to help adoptive families. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest today is Jennifer Gilmore, an adoptive parent and novelist. Some of her fiction books are based on her experiences trying to adopt a baby. Now, have you adopted a child or children? What's been your experience? You can join our conversation, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Jennifer, we were talking earlier that you and your husband decided to adopt after trying IVF at least 5 times. What was the cost at this point, working with an agency, trying to meet up with birth mothers? I'm just curious of how you handled that financial strain.
That's a really good question. I don't know exactly. I'm a writer, so I got paid in chunks. I know that. Also, I wrote about it a lot, and partially that was to get paid. I wrote, and then I wrote a piece for Vogue that was a very challenging piece to write, and someone I knew read it, and she offered to help me financially at the end. We could not have done it on our own, to be honest. We had an unusual experience for sure, but we went from an agency to a private lawyer. There are also, you want to help birth mothers as much as you can, but how do you protect yourself, protect them? So those aren't the only fees. You're also sort of, as through the lawyer or through the agency, assisting with someone you've matched with. So it's challenging. It really is challenging, and it's not for the faint of heart emotionally and financially. It can be very expensive. It can also happen very quickly. It just depends on the situation. You just don't know.
I had mentioned that you've written about this. You've used parts of your personal story to help shape some fiction that you've written. Do you feel like at the same time, while you want to get this information out to help prospective adoptive families, that your story might scare people off?
Yeah, absolutely. The Mothers was a novel for adults. And I was writing a different novel. And when this was happening to me, I just found it I wanted to make it interesting to myself. So I wasn't, I found like the issues of race and class and the sanctioning of motherhood in the culture and how adoptive children feel to be so fascinating that I wanted to write a book about the process. I feel like there were so many books about what happens when it's over and when everyone's happy. But the process, and it is a novel, but I wanted to be honest about the process. People write me all the time, should I give this to my friend who's adopting? And I'm like, maybe not. But then this book I wrote for teens, which came out last year, is called If Only. And that's a much more processed book. And it's much more from my imagination, but it takes the birth mother's choices and the adoptive child's choices and imagine sort of these alternative universe. We all could live so many alternative universes, especially in adoption. So it's more about imagination, I bet.
You can join our conversation if you're an adoptive parent or if you've been adopted as we talk about open adoption, this idea that adoptive families have this communication open with a biological parent or parents. The number 860-275-7266 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Sarah's calling from Kent. Sarah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sarah, and my husband and I are adoptive parents. Our daughter's now 15 months old. But yeah, we adopted in Connecticut, and we are still in touch with the birth grandmother and the birth mother occasionally. And it's been an interesting new process.
So congratulations on your new baby. I'm just curious why you chose open adoption. Did you feel that you'd have more success finding a child?
No, I mean, I think going into it, we didn't know much about what was done normally, but we did some research and saw that most adoptions in the U.S. now are open, and we read a lot of research that showed that a lot of older adoptees are happier when there is an open adoption. So yeah, in the end, we had to decide what was going to be best for the child, so we went that route.
Did you have any hiccups along the way? Jennifer, her journey to her baby that she was finally able to adopt was a rocky one. Did you have an easy journey, Sarah?
I'm not going to say easy. I think we were in a difficult place before we even got to the adoptive process as far as becoming parents. But the paperwork process and all of that is quite extensive, and they really, it's a really good thing. They look into your whole background. You're sharing basically every corner of your life. But when it came down to it, actually, it went super fast for us. We were only officially on the books for a couple months when we got matched. So we were really, really lucky.
Well, Sarah, thank you for calling in to Where We Live. The number 860-275-7266. It's interesting, Sarah mentioning that a lot of adoptions domestically now are open adoptions. So I wanted to bring into the conversation Ryan Hanlon, who's vice president for the National Council for Adoption. This is an advocacy group for adoptive families. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So maybe you could pick up on what Sarah was talking about. What does the adoption landscape, so to speak, look like in our country? Why are more people choosing open adoption, and why?
Well, Sarah, your caller, and Jennifer, your guest, were both right to say that the majority of adoptions are open in our country, and that has been the case for many years now. In terms of the landscape, every year there's approximately 18,000 or so private domestic adoptions, what we might think of as infant adoptions in the United States. And to answer your question, why? Well, we pursue open adoptions because when a child is adopted into a new family, it will sever that child's legal ties to their birth family, but it doesn't end the emotional connection that they have to that birth family. And so as a way to honor that, as a way to really help that child form healthy relationship dynamics, and the adoptive family to develop healthy relationship dynamics with their child and build trust and attachment, we encourage families to have a connection with the birth family after an adoption.
So how much does that cost on average for a family to have an open adoption?
So pursuing a private domestic adoption in the U.S. Can range pretty widely. A range from $20,000 to $30,000 is probably what most people would expect when they're going to pursue a private domestic adoption, and that's going to be impacted by a lot of factors. One of which is the adoption going to be in state or is it going to be out of state? And then what kind of time frame are we going to look at? Your caller Sarah said she had a relatively fast process. Your guest Jennifer had a very long process. That might require additional visits with a social worker, updating home study, things that could add more cost to the process.
When we were talking with Jennifer, she said that laws vary from state to state in terms of the rights of a biological parent, as well as, maybe there should be some more guidelines or protections for adoptive families. What can you tell us about the laws from one state to the other, Ryan?
Well, she was exactly right. They are different in every state, and so it would be important for anyone pursuing a private domestic adoption, or really any adoption, to ensure that they have a competent professional who's familiar with the laws and the processes in the state where they're pursuing an adoption. And even if they're going to be pursuing an adoption in another state, they'd want to have a competent professional, either an agency or an adoption attorney, in their state to help them navigate what's needed, and then they would partner with another competent professional in the state where the adoption is happening.
I have a document in front of me just talking about Connecticut laws. And so an adoption can happen about 48 hours after birth, but within a month, the birth parent or parents could seek to revoke that. Is that what we find in most states?
Yeah, and we have to be so careful with the language we use around this, because a placement might happen 48 hours later, but the adoption would only happen after that period of time has ended where a birth parent has an ability to change their mind about this process. And so even if a placement has happened, if the adoption isn't finalized, then a situation could happen where the birth parent has every legal right to change her mind or his mind and choose to parent their child. But to your question, yes, it's going to be different in every state. I live in Virginia, where birth moms have 10 days after birth where they could change their mind about an adoptive placement that they've made. And it doesn't necessarily have to be after birth. It would be after they make a decision. And so states often will have two different time frames. One of which is how many days after the birth of that child. Another might be how many days after an adoption decision has been made or an agreement has been signed.
Jennifer Gilmore joining us via Skype, again, an adoptive parent and novelist. So Jennifer, tell us about the time when you were able to finally adopt a baby. This was about 6 or 7 years ago?
Yes. I just want to go back to the state-to-state issue. So what you find also is people trying to adopt in states where the birth mother has less time. Or in Florida, and I don't remember what is the issue with Florida, but there's I think a very minimal amount of time that the birth mother has. So I don't know how it works exactly, why we have these different laws from state to state, but you have people really negotiating all these issues to get to a state where they're most comfortable adopting a child. So that was something that was of interest. So how we ended up with my son was not through an agency, not through the private attorney, but our home study worker who was in New York City she is with an agency. They don't do that much adoption, but they just had 1 or 2 a year. And she told us about one, and we were able to pursue it with new costs. And as I said, I had a very generous friend who was helping us. And that did not go down without drama. But my son was born in Colorado, and we were there. And here we are 6 years later. We have a relationship with the birth grandparents, with the birth mother. We don't see her, but we are in touch with her. We will see her, I hope. And every year, like the birth grandparents are coming next weekend to our home. I'm making them lunch. My son gets to see where he gets his red hair, auburn hair. And a child can't have too much love. And Trine's point about what's best for everyone, this really is. And I want to say also, I think it's best for the birth families who are grieving. And that's not negligible here, that an open adoption can often be really helpful to birth mothers. Not always, and some will choose not to be involved, and that's their right. But I think open adoption, there's so many families involved. You don't even realize. And so that is really best for everyone.
Michelle's calling from Wallingford. Michelle, you're an adoptive parent. What did you want to tell us?
I just wanted to share our story that as an adoptive parent, we've had a wonderful open adoption. We have a 4-year-old daughter. And one thing that really helped us in the process was using what we felt was a very reputable adoption agency. I know there's different ways to pursue domestic open adoption these days, but we found an agency here in Connecticut, Adoption from the Heart. And what we liked about them was they really provided a lot of support for birth parents by supporting in counseling and social workers and really people to work with them through this tough decision that they're thinking about pursuing. So we really found a lot of we really liked working with the agency, and working with the agency also helped us avoid the issue of scams. I know that was mentioned earlier in the segment. Basically, the adoption agency would meet with people that said that they were birth parents and screen them. And so if they weren't actually pregnant, we never heard from those people. So I think working with that agency was really a great resource for us, both so that we felt we had a very ethical adoption and to avoid scam type situations.
Well, thank you, Michelle, for your call. Sarah's calling from Norwich. Sarah, I understand you were adopted.
Yes, I was.
And can you tell me, we're talking about open adoption, and can you talk a little bit about your experience, and have you been able or want to reach out to your birth parents?
Yes, I've actually met my biological mother twice. I've gone out and visited her in California, and I am so happy that my parents decided to keep in contact with her, that I was able to meet her, and I have two half brothers actually that I've met as well. So I'm very glad that they decided to do that. But on the other hand, I don't know who I only know my biological father's name, but I've never met him, and we don't know, where he is. And so it almost feels like there's a little chunk missing because of that. So I'm glad that they decided with my mother that I could meet her.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for your call. Kay is calling from Cape Cod. Kay, go ahead. Kay, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Tell us a little bit about your story.
So my husband and I are the adoptive parents of 3 children. 2 are biological siblings. 1 is not. All 3 are biracial. One of the siblings we adopted at birth through a private agency, going through exactly what you've heard from some of the other callers. It was a long and arduous job of paperwork, and in the age for us back then, we weren't on social media, so it felt like a lot of privacy was giving up a lot of privacy for us, filling out paperwork, talking to friends and family who write letters. We got through all of that. We got matched with a birth mother. We went down and met her, and we were able to come home with this incredible baby boy. It was an all-private adoption. It is expensive. And in Florida, there is the termination of parental rights in 2 days. She agreed that she didn't want any further contact. She was attempting to raise her older son, who was about a year older. We came home, and we're raising our child no different than any other biological adopted child, and found later that she had passed away, and that we were that the older child was now available for adoption. He was in a non-legal status. There were some complications about trying to bring it home. It was a quasi DCF private adoption to bring him home from Florida, and the 2 brothers met and are now inseparable.
Well, thank you, Kay, for your call here on Where We Live. Again, everyone has a different adoption story. We're almost running out of time. I wanted to go back to our guest, Jennifer Gilmore. Everyone, as I said, has a different story. Cost can be an issue. Some people have success stories. Others are still trying. What's your advice to parents, Jennifer?
My advice to parents is just know your limits, but be as open as you can be and be as authentic as you can be. I mean, I think everyone's talking about the paperwork, and it is a lot of paperwork. But the more yourself you can be, the more you'll be seen for who you are. And I think that that's really important. That we're transparent and all of that. And going into it, it's hard to be both open and hopeful and also protective. So I think you can try to be all 3 of those things.
Jennifer Gilmore again joined us via Skype today. She's an adoptive parent, also a novelist of 2 books focusing on adoption, specifically The Mothers and If Only. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me.
Also, Ryan Hanlon was with us via phone, Vice President for the National Council for Adoption. Ryan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Coming up on Where We Live, I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're going to learn about efforts in Connecticut for adoptees to seek out their original birth records. Are you one of them? Join our conversation on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We've been talking about the experiences of parents seeking an adopted child or seeking to adopt a child. Now, if you've been adopted in Connecticut, have you tried to seek out your original birth records? Connecticut is among a majority of states where adoptees receive amended birth certificates that omit the names of their biological parents. In 2014, there was a change that helped adoptees born after 1983 to access that information, but that leaves many adoptees prior to that date still looking for answers. For more on that, Karen Caffrey is joining me now in studio, president of the nonprofit Access Connecticut Now Incorporated. Karen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
So explain a little bit about, why there's this cutoff in 1983 and why there's an issue with people obtaining their birth records in Connecticut.
All right. Well, that's a great question because it used to be the law before 1975 that all adult adoptees and their adoptive parents had the right to get the adoptee's original birth certificate. Some people are surprised to hear that. And when that was changed in the 70s, efforts have been going on since that time to try and change the law back. Our organization was successful in 2014 in getting it partially changed. That was a piece of compromise legislation. The reason that date was chosen in 1983 is because the state of Connecticut promulgated an affidavit that every birth parent had to swear and sign to before a court would approve the termination of their parental rights. And it put them on notice that when their child became an adult, that they might be able to find the birth parents or other blood relatives. So that was what the legislative compromise was about. And we have continued to work to extend that back to the pre-83 adoptees, including, folks like myself from the era, before the earlier era.
So you were adopted, but
yes.
You were able to, again, find you or at least know who your birth parents were because of your information or no?
Oh, sure. Yeah. The adoption agency, which my parents work with, was the Village for Families and Children, still here in Connecticut, the oldest social service agency in Connecticut, I believe, over 200 years. And they gave my adoptive parents my birth name. It was legal. And so I grew up, I had my birth name. My mother also was able to get it from the court at one point. So I had my birth name. It was pre-internet when I searched. I was a teenager when I searched. So it didn't happen overnight. I did find out that they had actually been looking for me but had been unsuccessful. So I've been in reunion, as we call it, for 40 years. My goodness.
So, when this has come up in front of the Connecticut General Assembly several times, what is the argument to keep this information private?
Well, the argument is, and there was a bygone era, and we say it's bygone, but it's still greatly influencing what happens now, where there was tremendous shame and stigma about a woman becoming pregnant when she wasn't married. And that really is what has driven the formation of all adoption laws, even as you referenced the dual birth certificate system, where an adoptee has their original birth certificate and then their amended birth certificate, which has their adoptive parents' names on it. That was intentional to make it look as if the adoptee was born to the adoptive family, to whitewash their tainted bad blood origins. And so the initial concern was actually to protect the adoptee and keep their identity private from the birth parents, because who knows what kind of terrible people they may be. Mm-hmm. As the field of social work evolved, the idea was, well, let's try and protect, quote unquote, the birth mother from having made this terrible mistake and being a fallen woman, a sinner in some religious traditions. And so the laws were then changed to really hide her identity and allow her to go forward with sort of a whitewashed life. So that's the social history that still informs a lot of the thinking around adoption. Birth parents and adoptees have been taught to fear each other. To fear their connectedness. And what's wonderful, I have to say, listening to your show today, that has changed so much. We now know that is not healthy for anybody involved. But that's the old mindset, and the small group of people and legislators who are opposed are sort of coming from that. Well, everyone was sort of promised nobody would know, and their lives will be destroyed, and this is just terrible, terrible. And in fact, it's a very tiny minority of women who do not want their identity disclosed to the adult adoptee. And by the way, we're talking about adults. not children. Your show today is about open adoption, which is about children.
Well, what about if there is a birth mother listening right now who, for whatever reason, had to put up her child and she doesn't want that connection? She doesn't want the biological child to be able to find her.
Right.
Again, you said it's a tiny minority, but they do exist.
They do exist. And I think the real game changer, and I would say this to those few women who, frankly, they're a small number, but they are frightened, or perhaps they haven't shared it with some of their family members or people in their community. You've probably heard of consumer DNA testing.
That's my next question.
You cannot turn on the television or look at the internet. You see Ancestry and 23andMe. It is exploding. In 2018, more people were tested, took a consumer DNA test for $59 on sale than in every year prior. I believe the figure is about 26 million Americans have been tested. And if it continues at that rate, in 2 years, there will be 100 million Americans who have tested. You are going to be impacted by this whether or not you have taken a DNA test. As long as anybody in your family, your niece, your nephew, your other children, your uncle has taken a DNA test, you are findable. And happily or sadly, in somewhat of a public way. I don't know if you've tested your DNA, Lucy, but if you have, you get an email back and all your biological relatives who have also tested are listed. So they would find out about this birth mother's decision before she even knows she's being looked for. And that is why the law that we're proposing is actually more private for everybody involved. The adoptee will get their birth certificate, then they have the name of the individual they're looking for. They can seek that person, make a contact, and that person may refuse contact. We live in an age where technology is changing everything. Whether we like it or not, we live in an age of transparency. It doesn't mean there is a thing that isn't called privacy, but it does mean that things that we thought were secret are not so secret anymore.
So what is the status? Again, I mentioned this has been proposed several times before the legislature. I know New York State just approved that they would allow adoptees to have access to their birth records. Again, I think it's like one of 9 or 10 states now that allow that. So where does Connecticut stand?
Well, New York would be the 10th state, and the bill has passed almost unanimously just this spring. Governor Cuomo hasn't signed it yet, but the signs are good that he will. We're going to be trying again in the next session because that's what we do. The bill this year, we came so close. We got farther than we ever did. It did pass the Senate this year. Thank you, Senator Steve Cassano, one of our champions, and Representative Christian McCarthy-Vahey in the House brought it forth on the House floor. Toward the very end of the session, there was some limited debate, but there wasn't enough time. So we're coming back next year, and we really are looking forward to getting this done.
Karen, any idea how many adoptees would be impacted?
Approximately 39,500, and their adult children and grandchildren.
Karen Caffrey, again, is president of the nonprofit Access Connecticut Now, Inc. We'll link to their website on our website, wnpr.org/where we live. Karen, thanks so much for joining us today to tell us about this.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Today's show is produced by senior producer Lydia Brown. Thanks also to our technical producer, Kyone Wolf, and Jesse Steinmetz on the phones today. Coming up Thursday, divestment is a word that might make your eyes glaze over, but you might want to give it a second look. Many college students are. On the next Where We Live, we're going to talk about what exactly is divestment and the broader implications for our environment. We hope you can join us on Thursday. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. You can always download our podcast, too, on any podcast app. Thanks for listening.